hope you can hear me. Occasionally I'm going to walk past this other microphone, so I'm going to get really, really loud. But I want to... there's a session that you're doing in the same groups that you were in yesterday, but it's a shorter session. I don't think we've got any Olympic medals to award. No. So this is just for fun, but it's trying to get you to deal with a sense-making problem. So I've constructed a problem which I'll explain in a bit. But before I do that, I'm allowed to talk for 20 minutes on stuff. So I'm going to talk for 20 minutes on stuff. So pick a card, any card. Remember your card. Concentrate on the card that you've picked, and I've made it disappear. That's good. Yes. So there are people looking completely flustered. I mean, it's a silly trick, because obviously the card that you've picked is then, and been told to concentrate on, is surrounded by other cards that are court cards, and none of those cards are here. So what I tend to do with my first year students that I do this on is to get them to pick through all of the cards on this screen, and you can see the penny dropping as they begin to realise what's going on here. But the point of this is to do with what details we attend to and what we do with the stuff that we haven't attended to. So there's the card that's important, and then there's all the other cards. And we've grouped all the other cards together in terms of other things. And because they're all grouped together in terms of other things, when I present you this set, this contains other things, but not your card. So we spend a lot of time picking up information that's probably going to be useful, and we have ways of categorising that information, and one way of describing those categorisations is using the word heuristics, rules of thumb. So we saw some of those this morning. And the literature in heuristics is a little bit ambivalent in the sense that some people recognise these as being very useful rules of thumb for analysing data. Other people use the pejorative term bias, and bias makes it sound as if they're really, really bad. But here's the problem, this is the second point here. If the heuristic leads to an answer which is correct or acceptable, then they're good. If they lead to an answer which is incorrect or unacceptable, then they're bad. So it's not the heuristics themselves that are good or bad, it's the outcome, and you don't know the outcome until after you've made the decision, in which case it probably was a good decision until afterwards. Because what you're doing with these heuristics is selecting from the mass of data, or the mess of data that you've been confronted with, and somehow putting a frame around that data. And that frame has been called a number of things. One is, that process has been called a number of things. One is bounded rationality, the idea that we are rational thinkers. We're not biased thinkers. We're completely rational, but with limits. So we, most of the time, make the correct decisions based on those bits of information that we happen to think is appropriate. The more experienced, the more expert we are, the better we are at selecting the right bits of information. The less experienced we are, the dumber our decisions. So if we look at types of biases, and there's a whole literature on biases, there's a point at which the study of bias becomes akin to stamp collecting, that people try to put a new bias into the literature. And if you were to have a book of biases, you'd probably get 300-400, many of them variations on the same theme.
Have you seen that on Wikipedia? It's pretty big.
So it's a big...
Yeah. It's really quite interesting, pretty big.
So there's an example. There's someone's stamp album on Wikipedia. I've just picked three. Representativeness, availability, confirmation bias. So the first one, and I'm linking this back to some crime scene examination stuff. The first one is in terms of, if we think about public perceptions of a criminal. How often are you watching television and there's a photograph of somebody who's been arrested for a crime, and they look the sort. They look the sort because it's a particular type of photograph that you have taken of you when you're arrested and prosecuted. Nobody is there doing this. But they also look the sort because you've had the big build-up towards what the crime is, and they then become an example of that type of criminal. So this is I'm jumping ahead. This is confirmation bias. Etienne Draw at Southampton University showed that even experts are prone to this sort of confirmation bias. He was looking at fingerprint analysts, and what the experiment involved was giving people a collection of fingerprints and then profiles of people who could have produced those fingerprints with their fingerprint sets, and you had to then say how confident you were that there was a match. Now, you'd expect if these were experts, there would be a completely unbiased and correct matching of fingerprint in all of the conditions. What he found was that if the fingerprints had been collected in a scenario which involved shoplifting, that was true. That the match between the fingerprints was consistent, reliable, and accurate across the different analysts. If they were collected from a scenario which described a murder, then some of the pen pictures of the people who provided the fingerprints seemed to bias or affect the interpretation of the analysts. So it seemed as if they then had an emotional response to the matching process, which got in between their analysis. So they were equally prone to confirmation bias. The neat thing about confirmation bias is that it's probably relatively easy to overcome simply by pointing out that it's probably happening. And that makes people step back enough just to say, hang on a minute, am I correct? It's often the case and a problem in police investigations that investigating officers will often stop when they found a viable suspect. Now, in common sense terms, that's much the same as saying when you've lost your keys, you stop looking when you found them. But in terms of criminal investigation, it's not necessarily the case that there is the one person. There may be one or two people, and you then have to, particularly when you have to present the case at court, you then have to test that through adversarial evidence-based argument. Yes, Robert?
Do you want to take a question?
I can do, as long as they're not difficult.
I want to interrupt your flow towards the activity, which I've already done. So you're... Well, the statement of confirmation bias I'm familiar with is the tendency to not look for disconfirming evidence.
Right.
So the question for those studies that you cited is, did they look at all for disconfirming evidence? Because if they absolutely failed to look for any disconfirming evidence, then I would wonder whether or not they were actually experts.
So, well, in both of these
Topic for beer.
yeah, okay. But I think the investigations, and the same in this Madrid bombing, that there were fingerprints that were gathered that had been contaminated but weren't recognised as contaminated because of the requirement to have fingerprints. So I think the point that I'm making is that confirmation bias may well be driven by other factors over and above the data that people are dealing with. Going back to the top of the list, representativeness bias is the tendency of people to pick the thing that they're most likely, or that's most easiest to imagine, the one that's at the forefront of their mind. So you often find that criminal investigations, particularly of violent crimes, begin with relatives because statistically relatives are the people that are most likely to cause violent crimes in police terminology. Interestingly, when you think about public perception of violent crimes, the assumption is it's some stranger that's come in because representativeness bias is driven by newspaper reports, and those tend to build on a story, a shared notion that violent crimes are committed by somebody who's come into the area that is unknown and does terrible things. So often when you see newspaper reports or television reports, the first reporting of the crime is not, please, a pretty good idea, it was the boyfriend. It's presented in such a way that some terrible thing has happened and a stranger's come into the midst and done stuff. And then if we were to think about that and said, well, okay, that's representativeness bias, then we'll say, well, I can think of at least 3 cases. It's almost always at least 3 cases where that's been true in the past, where there has been a stranger and that stranger has done these things. So that therefore proves, because these instances are available, they're ready to mine, they're easy to recall. So what you can see in these instances is the way in which our ability to attend to data becomes influenced by or affected by the frame that we decide to put onto the data. We saw this morning. I'm not going to go into much detail. So this is almost saying that there's potentially a flip side to the data frame sense-making model. But I think that what you need to do is to recognise that there is a frame and that you are responsible for it, and it does stuff to the data. And what experts are very good at doing is knowing the right frame to apply. So the exercise that I'm getting you to do later is to think about the frames that you're applying. And I'm going to get some of the experts here to wander around and stand behind you in a sort of threatening manner, making notes. And then later on there's going to be a panel where they come back and say, what do they think that you were doing? Before I do that, I've got a small case study to do, and then I'm going to stop at, what time is it now?
3:30. Oh wait, no, what is it? 8 minutes past.
No, it's 5 past.
5 past. I'm going to stop in about 20 minutes or less, and then you can have coffee on the way to the rooms where you're going to be working. So this is a scenario based on reports that are in public domain. So I'm not going to say anything here that's not in public domain. And it's about the outcry from the media that at least one of the bombers on the 7th of July bombings, 2005, was known to at least one security organisation. So the question that the newspapers were raising was, why wasn't this person arrested? Well, they weren't arrested because they hadn't done anything. However, in context, this was one operation amongst many. So this is a period of time leading up to the around the early 2000s. You've got a whole variety of different bombing plots. The ones that are in big circles are ones that you can find in public domain. The little circles are just me saying, and there's other stuff. And there's not many people doing the investigation, so they're not going to be able to follow everybody. So contrary to popular opinion, there aren't people at GCHQ listening into every single phone call and saying, this looks a bit suspicious. So the challenge is identifying somebody who was known in at least one of these scenarios as Ibrahim, who actually is called Mohammed Sadiq Khan. Sorry, was called Mohammed Sadiq Khan. So there are limited resources to do the checking and tracing, and multiple threats being responded to by multiple agencies. And we'll see in a minute the challenge of working across multiple agencies and the difficulty of sharing information. So, in one instance, we have this is Operation Crevice, I think, which was looking at a plan to put a fertilizer bomb, so that was the bomb of choice back then, in a limousine and park it outside a nightclub in the centre of London. So there was a limousine full of explosives, and that was being led by somebody called Omar Khayyam. You can see in the middle of this screen. So what we have then is a network of variety of people based around Crawley, which is East London, Sussex, then towards the southeast London. So.
A painted pass through on the
It's there, yes. So here we've got some observations in Crawley, looking at the relationship between Omar Khayyam, who's here in blue, who was recognised as a plot ringleader and some other people. In this particular investigation, those other people would be he was driven from Crawley to Leeds in a Honda, which was owned by Mohammed Sadiq Khan's wife, registered to Mohammed Sadiq Khan's address, and the driver was Mohammed Sadiq Khan. But it was Khan that was being followed rather than the other people. And in fact, those two people, one is Sadiq Khan, was identified as part of this plot as an unknown male who was probably a petty fraudster raising money to support the attempt. If you look up to the very top left-hand corner, there's those are fairly famous photographs that were shown on national television. These are actually better quality than the ones that were shown on television because they were then taken at Burger King and Leeds service station, but then cropped in such a way that you couldn't recognise that this was a Burger King, and then faxed so that Mohammed Junaid Baber, no relation, was shown this photograph and was asked, "Do you know this person?" Well, the person that they ended up looking at looked like a sock with a hat on, because it was such a badly copied image. So truthfully, he said, "No, I don't." So he doesn't identify either of those two, although he does know them both. But in this instance, plus with tape recordings from that car, there were discussions of not just the fertilizer bomb attack, but other forms of jihadi activity. Now, at the time, MI5, who were following the car from Crawley to Leeds, didn't tell West Yorkshire Police that they were following the car because they don't always talk to each other, security forces, and didn't make an investigation of the vehicle that they were following because they were interested in following Khayyam and finding out what he was doing, not about the vehicle. It wasn't until several months afterwards that there was an exchange of information and the cell had fallen through. Not only that, there was a set of activity being done by Leeds Anti-Terrorism Group where Khan was a known associate of somebody called Martin McDade, who was a converted and very radical Islamist who owned a bookshop in Leeds selling all sorts of jihadi material, sort of how do you make a bomb type of books and those sorts of things. So this was known, again with the same card, the same address, Khan, speaking to McDade, and following a series of meetings which led to Khan being identified as being of interest, he flew to Pakistan, where it's likely that he attended an Al-Qaeda training camp, hence the somewhat pejorative term here that he was a jihadi tourist. And this is somebody who goes to a country where they may be trained or attend a training camp, but probably won't act on the training. So they go and get trained and then they come back again. And it wasn't until much later that this relationship between different people, Mohammed Sadiq Khan and Ibrahim, who was being identified in other communications, when that relationship began to be made more clear. And again, it was Baber who was who then was able to identify Khan from CCTV images, which were much clearer and much easier for him to identify. So he was the person who first failed to identify Khan and then later on was able to. So what the press was saying was, well, surely this would have been easy to sort out. It's the same person. You can see from the pictures. But to give an idea of what was going on, if we were to draw a social network of the various people involved in the various things that were happening in the UK, there were weak links, which means small amounts of ties between different groups. That's how terrorist cells work. And the link between Khan and other people represented a very, very tiny fraction. There were other people that were of more interest than this one person. There was one officer who was following up a large number of contacts, over 4,000. And there wasn't a process for returning review information. It's just that one officer had a gut feeling that this may have been the same person, that things began to be put together, and these relationships between the different instances of the same individual became apparent. So if he had been identified, then there's an obvious potential for him to have been identified more or sooner. This doesn't mean to say, A, that anything necessarily went wrong, because part of this story is that's the nature of intelligence analysis very often. You've got incomplete data, and the people that you're dealing with are trying themselves to not be identified. So they're trying to hide themselves within their networks, and they're trying to obscure their own trails, cover their own trails. So what I'm going to do is to get you to do something based on, yes, a very nice old book called The Marseille Mafia, which is based on drug trafficking between Marseille and New York, that the film The French Connection was based on. So what you're going to do is to form teams, and some of you are going to be drug smugglers, and I'm going to give you guns, and you're going to run around the building shooting each other. No. Apparently health and safety prevents me from doing that. So what you're going to have is a pack of information that I've constructed about people who probably involved in drug smuggling. And I'm going to go through some of those images, some of those individuals in a few seconds. This is the scenario. So you've had intelligence, your team. And I don't care how you want to pretend, or who you want to pretend you are. Your team has had intelligence. There's a pack of stuff you're going to deal with. That there's going to be some drugs run from somewhere in the West Country up to Leeds. And what I want you to think about is sifting through the various bits of material. First of all, which is the person who you're going to arrest? Where do you think you will make the arrest? And I'd quite like, at your debrief, so you're going to do a debrief later, you to show the 5 bits of information or the 5 pieces of paper that you think best support your proposal. So those are the things that you're doing. You're looking through some evidence. You're going to identify a suspect, and you're going to say where you're going to arrest them. And in particular, I'm interested in seeing which out of that pile of information you decide is the most useful stuff. Oops, come back to that in a second. I've got a couple more slides, and you haven't said stop yet, so that's all right. Robert dismissed Parolian card this morning, so I thought, just for completeness, here it is. There are some loops in this, but the implication is that it's a linear process, as opposed to a very, very loopy process, like the data frame model. But the reason I'm showing you this is because I quite like the idea of the square boxes, which are the representations that people are using as they go through the decision-making activity. So you start off with your piles of paper, number 1. Number 4, something called a shoebox. Those are the bits of paper that you've decided to take off the pile and put somewhere else because they might be interesting. And they then start to form an evidence file because not only are they just a collection of stuff, but now they move from being a collection of stuff into some collection of stuff with an explanatory model. In other words, there's a reason for picking that stuff. And then that's then thought about, and the explanatory model is elaborated. This is what Peroni and Card, I think, called a schema. And then there's a hypothesis generated at the top. And the hypothesis generated at the top is really the story that you put onto the crime that you're using to explain and to structure the data. And I want to draw a distinction, or to take Floris Bex's distinction between different ways in which people might go about doing sense-making. Effectively, there's always a case with psychologists to see the top-down or bottom-up. So you either begin with a mess of data, you look for the patterns, and then you explain that. And the explanations are the arguments that you're building in terms of why things relate together and how those relationships are structured. So that's the bottom-up approach. Or you have a plausible story that you want to tell. So you may begin by saying, what do these drug smugglers do? Well, they've got to get the drug somewhere, they've got to transport it, stuff that's got to happen. And yesterday's activity was more or less an argumentation activity. So you had a mess of data. Most of you ignored the mess of data because you just concentrated on the design problem. But there was a mess of data to do something with. And then you had to visualize that and use that visualization to support decision making. This one is designed to be more of a top-down narrative. So there are stories that I think you'll be telling about what is it criminals do, how will they behave, how can we use that behaviour to explain the stuff that's on the bits of paper. What I expect happens is people switch between the two. But in intelligence analysis, I think there's a huge amount of activity that's spent on storytelling and trying to come up with a rational explanation based on incomplete and sometimes irrational data. So how do you fill the gaps in? Well, you fill the gaps in by making a story, then you use the story as a frame, and you use that frame to then start collecting more data and to define an intelligence collection plan to get even more data. If you pick the right story, then you solve the crime. If you pick the wrong story, you look a bit of an idiot. But if you look at all of the sort of, actually no, there's very few. I'm just thinking of television programs which show police work in action. The only really good television program that shows police work in action is House, and I know he's not a policeman, but what he does as his diagnostic activity of putting things up, ruling things out, checking for information is much closer to what police investigations look like than any police procedural program. So think House, and House is based on Sherlock Holmes, so think Holmes. So in order not to infringe anybody's civil liberties, unless anybody looks like this, I've taken images that don't look like people, and I'm going to do one or two sentences for each of the people. So part of your job is to make this even easier. Is to pick from 8 suspects. Otherwise, we'd spend longer than the hour and a bit that we've got allocated to this. So, David Pico, a petty criminal, is known to the police, has a record, is going out with Denise Arjaczynski, who is the twin sister of Jake Arjaczynski, who lives in Leeds in a very, very posh house in a very smart area, with a father who is, shall we say, independently wealthy. There's Denise. She also lives at the same address with the same independently wealthy father, and is the on-off girlfriend of David Pico. Kenny Chiappe. So all these names come from the Marseille Mafia, but they aren't the same people. Is a taxi driver in Leeds, and has also been known to the police for handling stolen goods and locally transporting drugs. Pierre Pasquidini is French, lives in Brittany, and is very good friends with a chap called Perrin, Perrin, who skippers a yacht back and forth between France and the UK. Vanessa Munoz is the assistant manager, I think, of the Exmouth Marina. I'm not saying that Exmouth Marina is involved in any way in drug smuggling, but I couldn't think of a place in the West Country that didn't have a marina and was on the coast. So she's the assistant manager of the marina in Exmouth. Muriel Grosby, she looks like a character from Scooby-Doo. She's a businesswoman in Leeds who owns a haulage firm and a minicab or taxi company. The police suspect that she's been involved in large-scale importation of illegal substances, but she's got several very good lawyers and a very good accountant, and there's nothing you can do to touch her. Martina Sati is the girlfriend of the owner of, or the manager of Exmouth Marina. I think that's all we need to say for her. Jennifer Garlica is the sister, much younger sister of Muriel Grosby, the younger widowed sister of Muriel Grosby. Her husband was violently murdered, and the police have yet to find the body. But they know that he was violently murdered because they found the head. So that's some references. So those are 8 people. One of those is going to be involved in moving drugs. And
different cognitive biases come into play. One of the pictures was really sleazy looking.
well, there we go. So solved. So what I want you to do then is to pick one of those, then say where you're going to arrest them, and then say what the 5 pieces of evidence are that you are going to use to support your case. So it's really, the exercise is really about picking the 5 pieces of evidence rather than identifying the individual. So you go off and do it in the rooms that you were in before. Yes? So you pick one of those 9 people. It's twins, isn't there? That's one of those 9 people.
Is it only one?
It's just the one, yeah. Well, no. I think I did say you might decide that you want to arrest more than one person. Yeah, get all of them. And the name of the individuals to target. But it could be one. I don't really. I have an idea of what I think the answer is, but I'd be quite interested if people come up with a different answer that's more plausible than mine.